Barron Trump was sitting in a crowded arena, the air buzzing with excitement. He had been invited to a high-profile charity event, something his father had pushed him to attend. But Barron, as usual, didn't care much for the glamorous world his family was entrenched in. This event felt like a world away from the struggles he sometimes saw on the streets or in the eyes of the people who crossed his path. He had always been different from the rest of the Trump family, a little more grounded, a little more aware of the world outside their golden bubble. The spotlight was on him tonight, and he didn't mind the attention, but his mind wandered. That's when it happened. The voice of Snoop Dogg echoed through the speakers. He had just wrapped up his performance and, with a mischievous grin, turned to Barron. "Yo, Barron," Snoop said, leaning into the microphone. "You know what I think? Go back to Africa. We don't need you here." The crowd froze. A moment of pure tension filled the room, and everyone turned to Barron, waiting to see his reaction. For a split second, Barron's heart raced. It wasn't the first time someone had thrown a jab at him or his family, but something about the way Snoop said it felt different. There was a sharpness in his tone that cut through the room. The eyes of the audience were on Barron, almost daring him to respond, expecting the usual defensive remark from a Trump. But Barron didn't give in. Instead, he stood still, his face unreadable. There was something brewing inside him, a fire he had never felt before. He knew the media would take this moment and twist it into something they could use against his family, but right now he didn't care about the cameras, the flashing lights, or the headlines. Instead, he took a slow step forward to the microphone, his calm voice echoing through the room. "You don't get to tell people where they belong," he said. "You don't get to define anyone's place in this world. Not me, not anyone." The room fell silent. People exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Snoop Dogg, standing there, caught off guard by Barron's unyielding response, stood still for a moment. The energy shifted, the atmosphere thick with tension. But then, unexpectedly, Snoop's lips curled into a smile, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. All right, Barron," Snoop said, holding up his hands. "I respect that." The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, but the weight of the moment lingered. Barron had just spoken up in a way few would have expected. The reality was that this moment wasn't just about one remark, it was about something bigger. Barron had crossed a personal line that could never be uncrossed. His response wasn't just about standing up to Snoop Dogg, it was about standing up to the world that constantly tried to define him. For the first time in his life, Barron felt something deeper, something that spoke to who he truly was. But what Barron didn't know was that this moment would set off a series of events that would change his life and his understanding of the world forever. The following day, Barron woke up to a storm of headlines. The usual crowd that followed his family's every move had erupted in discussion over the exchange with Snoop Dogg. While some applauded Barron for his maturity, others criticized him for not standing up in a more forceful manner. It seemed like every part of the media machine had a different take on what had happened the night before. Barron scrolled through his phone in disbelief. The comments ranged from praise to venom. He was no stranger to being in the spotlight, but today felt different. For the first time, the public wasn't just reacting to his last name, they were reacting to him as an individual. It was both overwhelming and strange. And as much as he tried to push away the noise, a part of him couldn't ignore it. Later that afternoon, Barron's father, Donald Trump, called him. "You did good last night," Donald said over the phone. "You know, showing some backbone, not taking crap from anyone. But you have to be careful. You can't let this define you. People will twist your words, Barron. You need to play it smart." Barron didn't respond right away. He knew his father's advice came from a place of wanting to protect him, but the words felt empty. Barron had never felt the need to play things smart in the way his father expected. It had always been about appearances for Donald, always about winning. But for Barron, last night wasn't about winning or losing. It was about standing up for what felt right, even if it wasn't the easy choice. That night, Barron took a walk through the quiet streets of New York. He needed space, away from the cameras and the press. He didn't want to be the rich kid who had everything handed to him anymore. As he walked, he passed by a small rundown building with a broken sign hanging above the door. It was an old factory, one of the many places Barron had passed by countless times without thinking twice about it. But something made him stop this time. The sound of laughter drifted through the open door. Curious, Barron walked closer and peeked inside. He saw a group of factory workers gathered around, sharing stories over some beers. They were laughing, but Barron could see the tiredness in their eyes. The exhaustion was evident, but so was the camaraderie, something he never saw in his high-profile world. One man with rough hands and a weathered face caught Barron's gaze. The man's face seemed familiar. Barron had seen him around town before, but he couldn't place him. "You lost, kid?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Barron hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "Just, looking around." The man raised an eyebrow. "Well, if you want to stay out of trouble, you better start looking in the right places." The words hit Barron harder than he expected. It wasn't just an offhand comment. It felt like something deeper. He had spent so much time looking up, watching the world through the lenses of wealth and status. But the world he was standing in now was different, grounded in something real, something raw. Barron didn't respond, but he stayed there, listening to the workers laugh, argue, and tell stories of their struggles. It felt like they were from a different world, one he had only seen through the headlines but never experienced. Suddenly the door swung open, and a woman walked out. She looked tired but strong, like she had seen too much of life to let anything keep her down. Barron watched as she walked past him, not noticing his presence. But as she passed by, she dropped a small piece of paper from her purse, and Barron instinctively bent down to pick it up. "Thanks," she muttered as she took the paper from his hand without looking up. Barron was about to walk away when something stopped him. He noticed a small, faded photograph of a child on the paper. The woman's child, perhaps? His curiosity piqued. Barron decided to follow her. Barron followed the woman down the street, maintaining a safe distance so she wouldn't notice him trailing behind her. As he walked, his mind raced. The encounter felt strange, but there was something pulling him toward her. He wanted to know more. Who she was, why she seemed so familiar, and why the brief moment they shared felt so significant. The woman turned a corner and entered an old apartment building. Barron hesitated for a second, but then walked up the steps behind her. He wasn't sure what exactly he was looking for, but something told him that this moment could lead him to answers he didn't even know he was searching for. Inside the building, the scent of old wood and faint cigarette smoke lingered in the air. Barron walked quietly through the hall, trying not to attract attention. He could hear faint voices coming from one of the apartments. The woman entered a door at the end of the hall and closed it behind her. Barron stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. A strange feeling of guilt washed over him. What was he doing here? Was this really his place? But something in his gut told him to stay, to push through the discomfort. This was a world so far removed from his own, yet it felt like a part of him was missing, like the luxury, the wealth, the headlines hadn't given him the answers he needed. He approached the door quietly and, as if by instinct, knocked lightly. Moments later, the door creaked open, and the woman stood there, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. "You again?" she asked, clearly surprised but not hostile. Barron swallowed, trying to find the right words. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. I saw you earlier, and you seemed like you were in a hurry." The woman glanced at him with skepticism, her arms crossed over her chest. "I'm fine," she said curtly, but there was a hint of weariness in her voice. "Why don't you go back to your world, kid? People like you don't belong here." Barron's heart skipped a beat. The words stung, but they were true in a way he couldn't deny. He was from a different world, one that didn't understand the struggle. But as he stood there, something clicked inside him. "Maybe I do belong here," he said quietly. "Maybe I don't need to keep pretending I'm someone I'm not." The woman studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. Then she sighed and stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "You want to understand? Then sit down and listen." Barron entered, feeling a strange sense of humility he had never felt before. The apartment was small, sparsely furnished, but there was a warmth to it that felt real. A small child played on the floor in the corner, oblivious to his presence. Barron sat across from the woman, waiting for her to speak. She looked at him seriously. "My name is Eva. I work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table for my kid. The system, it's broken. People like you, with your wealth and power, you have the chance to make a difference. But instead, you live in a bubble, never seeing the people who actually struggle to survive every day. Barron felt a knot in his stomach. Eva's words hit him harder than anything he had heard in a long time. He had spent so much of his life shielded from the reality outside his family's world. The luxury, the fame, the wealth. It all seemed so distant now, almost meaningless in comparison to the raw reality that Eva was living. She continued, her voice shaking slightly. People like Snoop Dogg, people like you, they say things that hurt, things that divide us. But the real fight isn't out there on the stage. It's here. It's in these neighborhoods with people like me who are just trying to survive. Barron's mind raced. This was the moment he had been searching for. The world he thought he knew was so different from the one he was beginning to understand. He had been living in a bubble, but now he saw the cracks, the flaws, the struggles of real people. Eva wasn't just a random woman. She represented something much bigger. "Why are you telling me this?" Barron asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eva met his gaze with a sense of quiet conviction. "Because you need to know. You need to understand that your actions matter, Barron. You have a choice. You can keep playing the game, stay on the sidelines, or you can step up and make things right." Barron sat in silence, absorbing her words. He had never considered the weight of his choices in such a personal way before. The world he had always taken for granted was now a stranger to him. But as he looked at Eva and her child, something deep within him stirred. He wasn't just Barron Trump, the son of a billionaire anymore. He was someone who had the power to change something, to make a real difference. It was a frightening thought, but it also felt like freedom. The following day, Barron couldn't shake the conversation he had with Eva from his mind. It lingered with him as he walked through his usual routine, attending meetings, meeting with advisors. But all the while, his thoughts kept drifting back to her words. What did it really mean to have power? Was it about wealth, influence, and success? Or was it something deeper, something more personal? He knew his father's view of the world. It was about dominating the game, being at the top, and keeping others beneath you. Barron had always accepted that notion without much question. But now, standing in Eva's small apartment, he realized that there was another side to power. The ability to help, to make a difference in someone's life, to actually see people who were often invisible in his world. But how could he reconcile this new feeling with his reality? Barron didn't know, but he was determined to find out. As the day progressed, Barron found himself stepping into a local bar, a place that didn't cater to the elite, but to everyday people like Eva. He walked in quietly, hoping to blend into the background, but immediately a few heads turned. It wasn't often that someone like Barron Trump would set foot in a place like this. He wasn't sure why he had come, but something was pushing him to connect with the people around him. At the bar, an older man with graying hair and a rough face glanced up at him. The man squinted for a moment, clearly trying to place Barron. After a brief pause, he nodded slowly. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," the man said with a smirk. "I gotta admit, I didn't expect to see a Trump here." Barron took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the man's judgment. "Just here to have a drink," he said casually, trying to ignore the discomfort building inside him. The man chuckled. "Yeah, that's what they all say. You're not here just for a drink, kid. You're here because something's bothering you. So what's it gonna be? You want to talk about the world, the system, or is this just some attempt to make yourself feel better?" Barron didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he wanted to make himself feel better or if he just needed to understand this new perspective. But as he stood there, he realized that the man wasn't wrong. There was something in him, something about his upbringing, about the pressure of being Barron Trump, that had always pushed him to keep his emotions hidden, to focus on the image, the power, the status. But here, in this moment, that image didn't matter. The people here didn't care about his last name or his family's wealth. They only cared about what he had to say, what he could do, and what he truly believed. Barron leaned against the bar, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been wondering, if power is really about helping people, why don't we do more of it? Why is it so easy for people like me to ignore the struggles of others?" The man didn't respond immediately, But after a long pause, he placed his drink down and looked Barron in the eye. That's the real question, ain't it? People get caught up in their own world, in their own success, and forget about the rest. It's easy to do, but it doesn't make it right. Barron nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He had always lived in a bubble of privilege, but now that bubble seemed so fragile, so irrelevant. It felt like everything he had known, everything his father had taught him, was slipping away. The man smiled knowingly, as if he understood Barron's internal struggle. You're asking the right questions, kid. But remember this, real change doesn't come from just talking. It comes from doing. So if you really want to make a difference, you've got to put your money where your mouth is. Barron felt a surge of determination. He wasn't sure how or where to begin, but the idea that he could actually do something, that he could change something, was a revelation. As he left the bar, Barron's thoughts raced. He had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this moment pass by. The world outside his bubble was more complex, more challenging, but it was also real. And Barron realized that the true test of his character, his ability to make a real difference, had only just begun. The next few days were filled with uncertainty as Barron tried to process everything he had experienced. He spent more time away from his father's world, stepping into places and situations where he could get closer to the people who needed help the most. His interactions felt different now, more genuine, more searching. He wasn't just performing the role of a wealthy young man anymore. He was trying to figure out what it meant to truly make a difference. One afternoon, Barron found himself in a neighborhood that was miles away from the luxurious towers he grew up around. He walked along the street, absorbing the sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic, the laughter of children, the sharp voice of a woman arguing with someone on the phone. He felt like a stranger here, but also there was something pulling him in. As he wandered, he spotted an old man sitting on a stoop, his clothes ragged and his face lined with age and hardship. Barron hesitated, then approached cautiously, wondering if the man would even acknowledge him. To his surprise, the man looked up, his eyes sharp despite the years etched on his face. "You look lost, son," the man said with a raspy voice, studying Barron with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Maybe skepticism, maybe pity. Barron didn't know what to say. He had never been in a situation where his wealth and status didn't matter. Here he was just another person on the street, trying to figure out his place in the world. "I guess you could say that," Barron finally answered. "Just trying to understand life, from a different perspective." The man smirked as if he had heard that line 1,000 times. "Understand life, huh? You're not the first rich kid to try. But let me tell you something. It's a lot harder than you think. People like you come here, see the struggle, feel bad for a second, then walk away. That's how it goes." Barron felt a sting at the old man's words. He had heard similar things before, but this felt different. "So what's your point?" he asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The man leaned back, squinting up at the sky. "My point is, it's easy to talk. It's easy to feel bad. But if you want to change something, you better be ready to get your hands dirty. You can't just throw money at a problem and hope it goes away. You've got to be part of the solution." Barron was quiet for a long time, digesting the man's words. He had always thought that his money and his name would be enough to make a difference. But now, sitting there with this stranger, he began to question that belief. Could money alone solve real problems? Or was it about something deeper, something more personal, more active? "Do you think anyone can really make a difference?" Barron asked, his voice quieter now. The old man's expression softened, just for a moment. "I think anyone who truly cares, who's willing to put in the work, can make a difference. But it's not easy. It's a long road, full of twists and turns. You can't just wake up one day and decide you want to change the world. You have to live it, experience it, fight for it." Barron nodded, the weight of those words settling heavily in his chest. He stood up slowly, feeling as if the old man's words had pierced through some part of him that he had been trying to ignore. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll remember that." As he walked away, Barron felt a fire burning inside him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He had a long way to go, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about changing the world. And for the first time in his life, Barron felt ready to take on that challenge. That evening, he sat down with a pen and paper, writing down everything that had happened in the past few days. As the words flowed, he realized something. He couldn't just talk about change. He had to be the change. His journey had just begun, and he wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to stop now. As the days turned into weeks, Barron found himself increasingly drawn into the lives of people who had always been invisible to him. He began volunteering at shelters, visiting food banks, and spending time with local communities who were facing struggles he had never truly understood. It wasn't easy. It was messy, it was painful, and sometimes it made him feel helpless. But with each passing day, Barron saw the world in a different light. One evening, after a long day of working with a group of refugees, Barron sat in a small cafe, reflecting on everything he had experienced. The people he had met, the stories they had shared, the moments of vulnerability that had revealed their strength. It was all so much to process. For the first time, Barron wasn't just walking through life with the certainty that everything would be handed to him. He was questioning everything he had ever known, everything his father had taught him, everything he had believed about power, success, and happiness. He had been to the top of the world, both literally and figuratively, but now as he sat there with the weight of the world on his shoulders, Barron realized that true power wasn't in control or wealth. It was in understanding, in humility, in making the effort to truly connect with others. It was about using whatever resources he had, not just to make money or boost his family's name, but to make the world a better place for people who didn't have the luxury of turning a blind eye. Barron was suddenly struck with a thought. Maybe this was what he had been searching for all along, the purpose behind all the success, the fame, the wealth. Maybe it wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about helping others find their own purpose, their own path to change. As Barron was lost in thought, a young woman walked into the cafe, looking exhausted but determined. She was one of the refugees Barron had been working with that day. Her eyes were filled with both sadness and hope. She approached Barron hesitantly, but when their eyes met, she smiled. "Mr. Trump," she began softly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. You've shown me that people like me matter, that we're not invisible." Barron was taken aback by her words. He had never expected something like this. It wasn't about praise or recognition. It was about someone real, seeing the effort he had put into making a difference. "You don't have to thank me," Barron replied, his voice raw with emotion. "I'm just trying to figure it all out too." She nodded, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "I don't think you understand. You're not just helping us with money. You're helping us believe in something bigger, in a future that isn't so bleak, in hope." Barron felt his heart swell. She was right. This wasn't just about charity or doing the right thing for a headline. It was about changing the future, about giving people a sense of belonging and purpose. It was about making sure that everyone, no matter their background, had the opportunity to create their own path in this world. As the evening came to a close, Barron realized that he had been on a journey of transformation, not just for the people he was helping, but for himself. The power he had been searching for wasn't the kind that could be wielded from the top of a tower. It was the kind of power that could heal, inspire, and empower. The kind of power that came from understanding, compassion, and action. Barron stood up, looking at the young woman one last time. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You've given me more than I could ever give you." And as Barron walked out of that cafe, he knew one thing for certain. His life was no longer just about wealth, success, or power. It was about the people, the stories, and the connections that could make the world a better place. And he was finally ready to dedicate himself to that cause, no matter where it took him.